He was lying on a stretcher and suddenly looked straight at her. "Doctor, I trust you with my life," said the soldier, recognizing his military doctor in the cleaning lady. She had been trying to hide for 6 years, but those words changed everything. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The city never slept, not in the tall towers of Cleveland, where ambulances wailed in the distance and the floodlights of the clinic shone through the night like a beacon of urgency. Daniela Moore had long ago learned to keep her head bowed, her steps measured, her presence unnoticed. Her orange custodial uniform, loose and practical, was her shield of invisibility. For 6 years, she had walked the corridors of the hospital at night, pushing her mop cart past closed doors and trauma bays that once would have been hers to command. Each night, the scent of antiseptic and the echoes of hurried footsteps brought her close enough to medicine to remember what it felt like, but far enough away to remain hidden from it. She was a woman shaped by battles, fought half a world away, but no one in this building saw it. To them, she was just the night janitor. Her dark skin gleamed under fluorescent lights, her strong shoulders bent under the weight of silence, her eyes lowered to the floor, she polished until it shone. They never knew that her hands had once been steady under mortar fire, that her voice had once carried authority over operating rooms filled with wounded soldiers. She had been Major Daniela Moore, an Army trauma surgeon whose commendations filled official records, but whose memories filled sleepless nights. Those memories were stitched into her like scars. She had joined the military young, determined to prove herself in a world that never expected much of her. Johns Hopkins had sharpened her intellect, Walter Reed had tested her skill, but Afghanistan had forged her into something unbreakable, and then broken her anyway. 3 deployments, hundreds of operations, each life saved or lost, etched into her memory like an indelible ledger. She had worked in tents that shuddered with explosions, in makeshift theaters where sand blew across sterile fields, in moments where the sound of gunfire blended with the beeping of monitors. She remembered the first time she cut into a soldier while shells thundered outside. Her hands had not trembled then. They moved with precision, guided by necessity and a fierce refusal to surrender another young life to chaos. In time, she became the one others looked to when the casualties piled up. The one who steadied them with orders, barked over the roar of helicopters, who taught them how to work fast when the air filled with smoke and dust. She had earned medals she never wore and respect she no longer claimed. But there were nights that undid her, nights she carried home like burdens strapped to her back. The convoy attack near Kandahar haunted her most, 15 wounded in 30 minutes. She saved 11 of them, her gloves soaked through, her voice raw from shouting instructions. 4 she could not save, no matter how desperately she tried. She could still see their faces, the 19-year-old from El Paso, the young woman from Portland, the tall corporal from Detroit, the girl from Atlanta with laughter in her eyes. Their names whispered through her dreams, demanding answers she could never give. When she returned stateside, the war followed her. Blood smelled of smoke. Every operating room became a battlefield. She would stand over patients and hear gunfire, would hold a scalpel and feel her hands falter. Therapy did little. Medications dulled her edges, but not her guilt. She began to freeze at the very moments she needed to move. Fear was not unfamiliar to her, but paralysis was, and it terrified her more than bullets ever had. She left the army with commendations and a reputation she could not carry, and so she disappeared. Disappearance meant survival. A custodial job offered steady hours, no questions, no responsibility beyond keeping floors clean and surfaces sanitized. At first, it had felt like defeat, but with time, The quiet became a kind of peace. No one asked her to save lives. No one asked her to make choices that could mean death. She blended into the background, a silent observer of the hospital's ceaseless rhythm. She knew which doctors rushed and which lingered, which nurses snapped and which soothed, which patients fought for every breath. And no one knew that the woman mopping blood from the floor had once stood where they stood. Still, invisibility had its price. Each night she walked past trauma bays and felt the tug of memory, the muscle memory of a profession she had buried. She noticed things others missed. IV lines set too low, machines calibrated incorrectly, the faint pallor of a patient signaling decline. Her body itched to correct them, but her mind recoiled. It was safer to remain silent. Safer to push her cart and lower her gaze. On this night, however, the air felt different. The hospital radio crackled with rising tension. There had been an accident, multiple casualties inbound. Construction workers, the dispatcher said. Critical injuries. The paramedics' clipped voices carried more than routine urgency. Daniela paused with her mop still in her hands, listening to details she could not turn off. Mechanism of injury, blood loss estimates, neurological scores. The words were a language she still spoke fluently, even if she no longer answered. Her grip on the mop tightened. Every instinct in her body told her that the hospital was about to descend into chaos. She began to clean Trauma Bay 3 as ordered, her movements calm, but her eyes scanning equipment with a surgeon's reflex. Pumps aligned, pads fresh, intubation kits stocked. No one noticed. They never noticed. She heard the sirens first, then the crash of doors opening. The paramedics wheeled in the first casualty, a young man, pale and bleeding, his body trembling in pain. The doctors hurried in, voices crisp but untested. Daniela stepped back against the wall, invisible as always, but her eyes moved faster than theirs. She catalogued symptoms, assessed likelihoods, saw what they did not yet see. She told herself to keep walking, to move to the next bay, to finish her shift in silence. But as the stretchers kept coming, as the young doctors faltered and the nurses barked for supplies, she felt the old weight pressing down. The battlefield had found her again, not in the sands of Afghanistan, but in the fluorescent glare of Cleveland. And as she pushed her cart aside and wiped her damp palms against her uniform, she knew that invisibility could not last forever. She did not yet know that among the men being wheeled through those doors were faces from her past. She did not yet know that one pair of eyes would find hers and recognize her through the disguise of years, uniforms, and silence. She only knew that her heart was pounding with the familiar rhythm of triage, and that the life she had built on being unseen was about to shatter under the weight of recognition. The trauma bay filled with sound monitors, shouted orders, the clang of metal instruments. Daniela stood in the corner, every muscle in her body remembering what it once meant to lead. She told herself she would remain still, that she would mop up afterward, that she would walk home at dawn the way she always had. But deep down, in the quiet place she tried to bury, something whispered that tonight would not let her hide. Tonight, the invisible janitor would be tested, and the surgeon she had abandoned would stir. And as the next stretcher barreled through the doors, as the flood of casualties became a tide, Daniela Moore realized that the past she had tried to escape was walking back into her life with every beat of her heart. The night had shifted from tense to unbearable within minutes. The accident that had seemed like one more addition to the endless stream of emergencies was becoming something larger, more chaotic, more personal than Daniela could have imagined. She stood near the wall, her cart pushed aside, her mop abandoned as the trauma base filled with bodies and voices. She had seen many nights like this in the desert, when a convoy was ambushed or a helicopter brought in more casualties than the staff could reasonably handle. There was a rhythm to it, a cadence of urgency that had once been her lifeblood. And now, even after years of silence, she could hear that rhythm echoing again in her pulse. One by one, the stretchers came in. Men with torn uniforms, their skin covered in blood and dust, the smell of smoke and engine oil clinging to their clothes. They were construction workers, she reminded herself, men caught in the collapse of scaffolding and steel. But as her eyes scanned their faces, something unsettled her. There was familiarity in the way some of them carried themselves, even unconscious, even broken. Her mind, unbidden, began to pull on memories she had buried. It happened suddenly, as one of the gurneys was wheeled into Bay 3. A man lay on it, his chest rising shallowly, his face pale under the harsh lights. His head turned slightly, and his eyes opened, clouded with pain but still searching. They fell on her, standing there in the orange custodial uniform, and widened with recognition that pierced her invisibility like a blade. The name came to her before she could stop it. Marcus Hill. Once a sergeant in her unit, brought into her field hospital 6 years earlier, with shrapnel tearing through his abdomen. She remembered the night air vibrating with explosions as she operated on him, the frantic hands of medics pressing gauze, the raw determination in her chest not to let him die. She had cut, stitched, repaired, and finally watched his breath steady under her hands. Against the odds, he had survived, and she had carried that victory like a fragile flame in a storm. Now, impossibly, he was here. Older, scarred, but undeniably the same man. His lips parted, his voice cracked and barely audible, but she read the words in the tremor of his mouth. He had recognized her. He remembered. In that moment, the weight of 6 silent years pressed harder against her chest. She felt the ground tilt beneath her. The doctors clustered around Marcus, their voices sharp, uncertain. Orders were given for scans, for fluids, for vitals to be checked again and again. She stayed where she was, her heart pounding so hard it felt visible through her uniform. But then Marcus's eyes found hers once more, and though his voice was little more than breath, she caught it. He was asking her to save him again. He was not looking at the doctors in crisp coats, or the residents fumbling with IV lines. He was looking at her, the woman everyone else ignored, and he was telling her he trusted her hands once more. Her throat tightened, as though invisible hands gripped it. The fluorescent lights blurred, the noise of the trauma bay muffled. For 6 years she had lived unnoticed, and now, in one fragile instant, her invisibility had cracked under the gaze of a man who knew her not as a janitor, but as the surgeon who had brought him back from death once before. She forced herself to breathe, but the act did not calm her. Memories rushed in too quickly, too vividly. The heat of desert nights, the metallic taste of fear, the sound of boots pounding outside as shells exploded. She remembered Marcus screaming, his blood flooding the table, her own voice firm as she called for clamps, for suction, for anything that could hold back the tide. She had not allowed herself to remember him for years, because remembering him meant remembering all the others she had lost. But now he was here in front of her, his trust tangible, his life once more in her reach. The staff worked frantically around his bed, but she could already see what they could not. His abdomen was distending, his pressure dropping in a rhythm she knew too well. This was internal bleeding, catastrophic, if not addressed immediately. She had seconds to decide, and in those seconds, her own world of silence threatened to collapse. She told herself to remain still, to let them handle it, to keep her invisibility intact. Yet every instinct screamed at her to step forward, to lift her voice, to take back the authority she had abandoned. She moved closer, slowly, as if her body acted before her mind consented. The staff barely noticed her. They never did. But Marcus did. His eyes tracked her, his trust unwavering, even as his consciousness faded. She felt something inside her chest that had been dormant for years stir awake. It was not pride, not duty, but the raw bond between a healer and the life before her. Her hands trembled, not with weakness, but with memory. She could almost feel the weight of a scalpel pressing into her palm again. The old rhythm returned, terrifying and familiar. She had thought herself broken, too fractured to ever practice again. But Marcus's faith was louder than her doubt. He had believed once, on a night filled with fire and chaos, that she could save him, and he believed it still. The others did not know her name, did not know her history, did not know that she had been forged in battlefields more merciless than any training could prepare them for. But Marcus knew, and in his eyes, she was still Major Moore, still the surgeon who had refused to let him die. The trauma bay swirled with movement, but for her, it narrowed into a single focus. His life, his trust, his plea. The years of silence crumbled like dust beneath the weight of it. She felt her pulse steady, her breathing deepen, her muscles align with a discipline she thought she had lost. This was no longer the janitor standing in an orange uniform by the wall. This was the surgeon, called back into existence by the memory and belief of a patient who had once lain on her table bleeding and had lived to see another dawn. The realization struck her with equal parts terror and clarity. She could not remain invisible anymore. Not tonight. Not with Marcus lying there, depending on her once more. And as the monitors blared and the voices rose around her, Daniela knew she was crossing a threshold she could never retreat from. The life she had built in silence was ending, replaced by the return of a part of herself she thought she had buried forever. Her hands no longer trembled. They steadied with each breath. She took one more step toward the man who believed in her, and with that step, invisibility became impossible. The night that had begun with routine silence was transforming into something she had not faced in years, the call to act, to heal, to lead. And in the trust reflected in Marcus's fading eyes, she found the courage she had been denying for too long. The hours that followed blurred into one long corridor of urgency, light, and noise. Daniela had stepped forward, and once she did, there was no turning back. The mask of invisibility that had shielded her for 6 silent years had crumbled, and in its place stood the surgeon she had tried to bury. The trauma bay became her battlefield again, and every decision she made was guided by the old instincts that returned as though they had been waiting for this moment. Marcus lay at the center of it all, his body weakened, his breath shallow, his pulse slipping into dangerous territory. She had moved close to him, her voice clear in a space that had long forgotten her presence. The young doctors glanced at her with confusion, some with suspicion, but they listened when she spoke. There was no mistaking the authority in her tone, the certainty in her words, the weight of experience that no textbook or residency could provide. She ordered preparations for immediate intervention, bypassing the slower protocols that might have cost him his life. For a fleeting moment, there was resistance-furrowed brows, doubtful glances, but when Marcus's vitals plunged and his body arched with pain, her judgment could no longer be questioned. As the staff scrambled to comply, her mind was already ahead, calculating each step, anticipating complications, remembering with frightening clarity the night she had once fought to keep this same man alive in Afghanistan. She had told herself those memories were poison, that they would paralyze her, but here they became her strength. The desert heat, the roar of helicopters, the smell of smoke, all of it lived again in her senses, but instead of breaking her, it sharpened her. She knew what to do because she had done it before, and because Marcus had trusted her to do it again. When they wheeled him into the operating room, the team looked to her as if by instinct. They might not have known her name, but they recognized the presence of someone who belonged at the head of the table. She took her place, her hand steady, her breathing even. The scalpel felt foreign in her grip for the briefest moment, and then it felt as natural as it ever had. The years of silence dissolved with the first incision, and in their place surged the rhythm of the work that had once defined her life. Every cut, every suture, every command was precise. She operated not only with skill, but with the memory of what Marcus had meant on that battlefield years ago. Saving him now was more than saving a patient. It was saving a thread that connected her fractured past with her uncertain present. It was proving to herself that her hands were not cursed, that her knowledge had not vanished, that she was still capable of preserving life rather than watching it slip away. The operation stretched on, hours melting into each other as she fought against the hidden bleeding that threatened to end him. Her body ached, her eyes burned, but she pressed forward with a determination that reminded her of who she had been before the nightmares stole her confidence. Around her, the staff worked tirelessly, following her lead, finding in her calm voice and decisive actions a refuge from panic. She did not notice when some of them began watching her differently, not as the janitor in orange who had passed unnoticed through their halls, but as a surgeon who commanded the room with the force of lived experience. At last, when the bleeding was controlled, when Marcus's pulse steadied and his chest rose with the strong rhythm of life, she allowed herself to breathe. The monitors no longer screamed their warnings. The staff no longer moved with frantic urgency. There was still work to be done, but the tide had turned. She had brought him back, again, as she had once done in a desert far from here. When they wheeled him to recovery, she lingered at his bedside for a moment, watching the lines on his face soften as unconsciousness yielded to something calmer. He looked younger now, more like the soldier she remembered, the one who had gritted his teeth against pain and whispered his faith in her hands. She had not failed him then, and she had not failed him now. The thought left her trembling, not with fear, but with a release she had not allowed herself in years. But the night did not end with Marcus. More casualties from the accident continued to pour in, and with the staff stretched thin, she found herself drawn into case after case. One man with burns along his arms, another with a collapsed lung, another with a crushed leg that required rapid stabilization. She moved among them as though she had never left the operating rooms, as though the 6 years of silence had been only a long night between shifts. Her voice guided, her hands directed, her presence steadied. It was in the faces of the patients that the weight of her decision truly struck her. They looked at her not with confusion or doubt, but with the desperate gratitude of people who saw in her someone who could keep them alive. Some of them, she realized with a start, were veterans too. She recognized the tattoos, the scars, the posture of men who had once worn uniforms, who carried the same invisible weight she bore. When their eyes met hers, she saw flickers of recognition, not of her, perhaps, but of what she represented. One of their own, a healer who had walked the same fire and carried the same ghosts. As dawn broke and the chaos subsided, she found herself in the surgeon's lounge, her body heavy with exhaustion, her hand still trembling faintly from the intensity of it all. She had been invisible when the night began, and now she was anything but. The staff whispered in the hallways, the administrators asked questions, and the patients she had touched carried her name on their lips. Daniela Moore, the janitor, no longer existed. Daniela Moore, the surgeon, had returned whether she had chosen it or not. Yet beneath the exhaustion, A quiet fear gnawed at her. She knew what came next. There would be questions she was not ready to answer, scrutiny she had no desire to face, expectations she might not be able to bear. For 6 years, she had hidden because she could not trust herself, because the memories had been too heavy, the guilt too sharp. And now, in one night, she had undone all the walls she had built to keep herself safe. She sat in the silence of the lounge, her head in her hands, listening to the hum of the vending machine and the faint echoes of footsteps outside. Her body ached with the familiar weight of service, but her mind reeled with uncertainty. Had she done the right thing by stepping forward? Had she condemned herself to reliving the same pain that had once broken her? She thought of Marcus again, of the way his eyes had lit with recognition, the way his lips had formed words she alone could understand. "I believe you will save me again." It was that belief that had pulled her out of hiding, that had steadied her hands when they might have faltered. It was that belief that had reminded her of who she was, and perhaps of who she was still meant to be. But belief alone could not erase 6 years of fear. Belief alone could not silence the memories that would return when she closed her eyes. She knew this night had changed everything, but whether it was for better or worse, she could not yet say. As the first rays of morning sunlight filtered through the hospital windows, she rose slowly, her body stiff, her mind heavy with unanswered questions. She stepped back into the hallway, into the place that had once been her refuge of invisibility, and felt the weight of every gaze that now followed her. There would be no return to silence. There would be no return to the safety of being unseen. Marcus lived, and because of that, her secret life was gone. What awaited her now was something larger, something she had avoided for years. A reckoning with her past, with her pain, with her purpose. She walked slowly down the corridor, each step heavy with the knowledge that the war she had been running from was no longer confined to memories. It had followed her here, into the hospital halls, and it would demand that she fight once more, not with weapons, but with her hands, her knowledge, and her heart. The day was only beginning, and Daniela Moore could no longer pretend to be invisible. She was seen now, and being seen meant she would have to choose whether to retreat again or to step fully into the light of who she once was. The decision would come soon, and it would not wait for her to feel ready. And as the hum of the hospital grew louder, with the arrival of new patients and fresh staff, she realized that readiness might not matter at all. What mattered was that she had been called out of silence, and the world would not let her return to it. The weight of the night lingered long after dawn had spread its pale light across Cleveland. Daniela walked through the corridors of the hospital with the heaviness of someone who had shed one life and stumbled unwillingly into another. Just hours earlier, she had been a janitor in a bright orange uniform, pushing her mop cart quietly from one room to another. Now she was something else, something she had buried beneath layers of fear and silence. The transformation had not been a choice, not truly. It had been demanded of her when Marcus lay dying, when his eyes met hers and reminded her of a promise she had once made on a battlefield half a world away. She had not slept. Her body was too alive with adrenaline, her mind too restless with memories she had fought to suppress. In the surgeon's lounge, she had sat in darkness and silence, trying to convince herself that this was a single night, a single choice, an exception forced by circumstance. But the world beyond those walls was already moving, already reshaping itself around her. Word of what she had done had spread faster than she could have imagined. Staff who had passed her in hallways without recognition now looked at her with curiosity, some with awe, some with suspicion. She had saved lives in the span of a few hours, but she had also broken the quiet safety of invisibility she had lived in for 6 years. It was not long before she was called into the office of Dr. Nathaniel Brooks, the chief of surgery. He was a man of broad shoulders and silver hair, with the steady bearing of someone who had long ago learned to balance authority with restraint. On his desk lay a folder that contained her name, her history, her military record, things she had tried to put away and forget. He spoke with measured calm, not anger, not judgment, but the kind of curiosity that cut deeper than either. Why, he asked without needing to raise his voice, had she hidden herself for so long? Why had she let her talent wither behind a mop and bucket, while patients bled and suffered around her? Daniela answered honestly, her voice thick with the weight of memory. She spoke of Afghanistan, of the lives lost despite her hands, of the faces that haunted her every time she held a scalpel. She admitted the truth she had told no one, that she had stopped trusting herself to be a surgeon, that she had feared her brokenness more than she had feared obscurity. She had chosen to disappear not because she lacked skill, but because her heart and mind could not bear the burden of holding lives in her hands anymore. Dr. Brooks listened quietly, then leaned forward and folded his hands. He told her that fear was not weakness, that doubt was not disqualification. What mattered was what she had done when it mattered most. She had been invisible for 6 years, but when the moment came, she had stepped forward. That, he said, was the mark of a healer. He offered her no judgment, only a truth she did not know if she could accept. The hospital needed her. The trauma ward was overwhelmed, the demand unending, and her skills undeniable. He offered her a path back, not as a janitor who hid behind shadows, but as a surgeon who saved lives in the light of day. The offer left her reeling. She left his office with papers in her hand and a storm in her chest. The thought of returning to surgery as anything permanent terrified her. To accept meant stepping fully into a world that had broken her once already. To refuse meant returning to invisibility that would no longer be possible, not after the night that had passed. As she walked the corridors, patients' families turned their eyes toward her with whispers of recognition. Nurses nodded. Security guards offered quiet respect. The anonymity she had perfected was gone. She visited Marcus in recovery before she left the hospital. He was pale but stable, his breathing even, his vitals strong. When his eyes opened and met hers, the faintest smile curved across his lips. He whispered words that were both a memory and a prophecy. "I knew you would save me again." Those words struck her deeper than any commendation or formal recognition. They carried her back to the battlefield, to the dust and smoke, to the blood-soaked nights when she had fought desperately against mortality. She had saved him then, and she had saved him now. That was the thread connecting the woman she had been with, the woman she had tried to bury. At home that evening, she sat alone in her small apartment with the hospital's offer lying on the kitchen table like a weight. She stared at the papers without touching them, the silence pressing down on her. Memories came unbidden, one after another. The convoy attack that had shattered her confidence, the 4 soldiers she had lost despite everything she knew, the endless nights when she had replayed their faces until she could no longer sleep. She poured herself a glass of water and set it down untouched. Her hands trembled the way they once had in the operating room, and she wondered if she was doomed to repeat the same cycle. And yet, Marcus's face returned to her again, younger somehow, almost peaceful despite the tubes and wires. His faith in her had been absolute. His survival was proof, not just of her training, but of her resilience. She had stepped forward in the moment of crisis and found her hands steady, her instincts sharp. She had not failed. The thought was fragile, but it grew in her mind as the night deepened. Days turned into weeks, and with each one, she felt the walls around her life thinning. She could not go back to mopping floors. Patients she had touched spoke of her. Staff who had worked alongside her spread word of her skill, and soon enough, her presence in the trauma ward became less a question and more an expectation. She returned first to consult, then to assist, then, finally, to lead. The transition was not without fear. Every time she scrubbed in, the memories threatened to break her, but she learned to breathe through them, to ground herself in the present rather than drown in the past. The veterans she encountered in those days became her anchors. Some were patients, men whose bodies bore the marks of battles fought overseas, men who recognized something in her eyes that mirrored their own. They did not question her past, they accepted it. One of them, a man named Elijah Carter, bore a scar across his chest that she herself had stitched in a combat hospital years ago. When he realized who she was, he grasped her hand with surprising strength and told her that he had never forgotten the surgeon who had pulled him back from the edge. He told her that, if she could save him once, he had no doubt she could save him again. Those encounters reshaped her fears into something else. The guilt did not vanish. The nightmares did not disappear. But they were no longer chains that bound her. They became scars, reminders of battles survived. Proof that healing was not only for the body, but for the soul. With each patient who trusted her, with each life she touched, she felt her strength returning. Slowly, invisibility gave way to presence, and presence gave way to purpose. Months later, she stood in Trauma Bay 3, the very place where her invisibility had ended, leading a team of young residents through the chaos of a mass casualty event. Her voice carried clear across the room, her command steady, her presence a beacon in the storm. She worked alongside colleagues who now saw her not as a shadow, but as a leader, not as a janitor, but as a surgeon whose hands could be trusted in the darkest moments. When the night ended and the patients were stable, she found herself once more in the lounge. But this time, she was not alone in silence. Colleagues sat beside her, sharing weary laughter, offering her coffee, speaking to her as one of them. She realized then that invisibility had been its own kind of prison, one she had built for herself. The key to escape had been within her all along, waiting for the moment when someone's faith would remind her of who she truly was. Daniela Moore did not forget her years of silence, nor did she deny the pain that had driven her into hiding. But she no longer let them define her. She carried them as part of her, as lessons etched into her being, as proof that healing often begins in the shadows before it can step into the light. Marcus's survival, Elijah's gratitude, the countless lives she touched, they were the foundation of a legacy she had never intended to build, but now embraced fully. And as she walked through the hospital's corridors at dawn, sunlight spilling through the windows, she felt something she had thought lost forever. Hope, not fragile or fleeting, but steady, like the rhythm of a heart that had survived its own battle and chosen to beat again. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch our other videos for more powerful stories still to come. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too important to keep to yourself.